Autumn 1887. By the time the first frost crept across the valley floor, nobody noticed what was happening beneath Samuel Garrett's barn. From the outside there was nothing unusual about it. Just another weather-beaten structure standing against the wind. Rough-hewn timber darkened by years of sun and snow. A sloped roof patched with tar paper. Hay bales stacked thick against the north wall to break the worst of the winter gusts. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, an ordinary barn belonging to an ordinary farmer preparing for another brutal frontier winter. And that was precisely the point. While his neighbors stacked firewood in towering piles, while they packed moss and clay into every crack of their cabin walls, while they prepared to battle winter the same way their fathers and grandfathers always had, Samuel Garrett was doing something entirely different. He was digging. Not out in the open. Not where anyone could see. But straight down, beneath the barn floor itself. People would have laughed if they'd known. Some probably would have tried to stop him. Others would have called him reckless. A few might have whispered that the years spent underground in the copper mines had finally broken his mind. Because in 1887 Montana, you didn't dig to survive winter. You burned wood. You fought the cold. You endured it. That was the rule. But Samuel Garrett had learned something most men in the valley never had. And that knowledge would soon change how people thought about warmth, shelter, and the very ground beneath their feet. If you want to discover one real survival technique every week, ideas that weren't theories but methods that actually worked when lives depended on them, hit that subscribe button now and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single comment. Because what happened during the winter of 1887 would quietly rewrite the rules of survival in this valley forever. The question wasn't whether Samuel Garrett was crazy. The real question was this. What did he understand about survival that everyone else had completely missed? This wasn't some desperate gamble. It wasn't the act of a man panicking in the face of winter. It was the result of 10 long years underground, working the copper mines deep in the mountains. Samuel had spent a decade descending into darkness before sunrise and emerging long after daylight faded. He worked shifts in tunnels that stretched hundreds of feet below the surface, places where the seasons didn't exist. And down there he noticed something that every miner knew but few ever truly thought about. The temperature never changed. It didn't matter if it was a scorching July afternoon or a frozen January night when the air above ground could kill exposed skin in minutes. In the tunnels the rock stayed the same. Cool, steady, predictable. Not cold enough to freeze. Not warm enough to sweat. Just constant. Most men saw mining as brutal labor, something to endure until they could escape. Samuel saw it as an education. He learned how Earth insulates, how depth creates stability, how the planet itself maintains a baseline temperature completely independent of the weather raging on the surface. The Earth didn't fight winter. It ignored it. When Samuel finally left the mines, bought a small parcel of land, and began raising his family in a valley where winter routinely killed livestock and sickened children, that knowledge stayed with him, quietly waiting. Waiting for the moment when survival would demand something different. That moment came the winter his youngest son nearly didn't make it through February. Samuel Garrett wasn't a man who drew attention. At 42 years old, he looked like dozens of other settlers scattered across the territory. A former copper miner who had bought his claim with savings earned underground. There was an irony in that he appreciated deeply. After spending 10 years tunneling through rock for someone else's profit, he was now digging again, but this time for his family's survival. His wife, Margaret, kept the household running while managing their 3 children. Elizabeth was 9. William was 7. Little James had just turned 4. Their cabin was solid by frontier standards. Pine logs. A stone foundation. A fieldstone chimney Samuel had built himself. In 1887 Montana, it was respectable. But respectable didn't mean warm. Every winter told the same brutal story. Temperatures plunged 20, 30, sometimes 40 degrees below zero. The wind screamed down from the mountains, hunting for every seam, every weakness, every poorly sealed joint in wood and stone. Firewood was life, and it was becoming harder to find. The nearest good timber stood 3 miles uphill. Samuel would spend 2 full days cutting, another hauling with the wagon. A good season meant 12 to 15 cords stacked beside the cabin. And still it wasn't enough. The firebox demanded feeding every 4 hours. Sometimes more when the cold tightened its grip. At night the fire would burn low. By morning, ice traced delicate patterns on the inside of the windows. The children slept in one room, packed together under every blanket the family owned. Margaret heated stones in the hearth, wrapped them in cloth and tucked them into the beds. By midnight the stones were cold again. James had been sick twice the previous winter. A wet cough that wouldn't loosen. Shallow breathing that terrified Margaret during the long silent hours before dawn. When the doctor finally arrived from Helena, 3 days late due to weather, he said it plainly. The cold weakens them. Samuel stood in the barn that spring, watching his breath fog the April air, and made a decision that would set him apart from every other man in the valley. He had spent 10 years underground. He knew something they didn't. 6 feet down the earth didn't freeze. 6 feet down temperature stopped obeying the seasons. 50 degrees. Maybe 55. All year long. The earth didn't burn fuel. It didn't leak heat through cracks. It simply existed, steady and indifferent. That summer, while his neighbors repaired roofs and split wood, Samuel Garrett started digging beneath his barn floor. He didn't announce it. He didn't ask advice. He didn't seek permission from men who would have told him it was foolish. Every morning after chores, he disappeared into the barn with his old mining pick and a bucket. Margaret brought him water at midday. Asked how it was going. He nodded and went back to work. The children knew their father was building something, but they didn't ask questions. In a place where survival was measured in cordwood and canning jars, everyone had their projects. What Samuel was building wasn't just shelter. It was a lesson in physics that most farmers never learned, because they never had to. And when winter returned, it would force the valley to confront a truth hiding just beneath their feet. Samuel spent that first night underground alone. He carried down only what he needed: a thermometer, a notebook, and a single wool blanket. No fire. No extra insulation. Just the chamber as it was, unfinished but functional. Above him, the cabin stove burned strong through the night. By morning, the thermometer in the cabin read 48 degrees. Respectable by frontier standards. Hard-earned with hours of fire tending. The thermometer underground told a different story. 53 degrees. 5 degrees warmer. With no fire at all. Margaret didn't argue. She didn't debate. She didn't need convincing speeches or theories about thermal mass and earth insulation. The talk didn't stop. It grew. At the supply store, men shook their heads over sacks of flour and barrels of nails. Garrett's going to freeze his family trying to prove some mining trick works on a farm. In the small wooden church on Sundays, women glanced at Margaret with something between concern and quiet judgment. After one service, Mrs. Henley, who had survived 40 Montana winters and buried 2 husbands, pulled Margaret aside. "Your husband's a good man, dear," she said gently. "But sometimes good men get strange ideas. Don't let pride put those children in danger." Margaret didn't respond. What could she say? That she had stood in that chamber and felt warmth without a roaring fire? That it stayed steadier than the cabin ever had? That her husband had spent 10 years learning something underground that might save them all? It would have sounded defensive. Like a wife covering for a man who'd gone too far. So she stayed quiet. And the assumptions filled the silence. When November gave way to December, everyone in the valley believed the same thing. Samuel Garrett was about to learn his lesson the hard way. December 1887 arrived cold, and stayed that way. By the second week, the thermometer outside the Garrett cabin read 15 below zero at dawn. By the third week, 25 below. Snow wasn't the real enemy. It rarely was. The wind was. It came down from the high country like something alive, steady, relentless, hunting. It forced cold air through cracks no one knew existed. Chimneys that had drawn perfectly the year before began to backdraft, filling cabins with smoke. Carefully dried firewood absorbed moisture from the air and burned poorly. Creosote built up faster than anyone expected, forcing men outside in brutal cold to clear flues with frozen hands. The valley began to lose ground. Caleb Drummond, Samuel's nearest neighbor, burned through wood at nearly twice his normal rate. His wife moved the children into the kitchen, the only room they could keep remotely warm. Even there, with the cook stove running day and night, the temperature hovered in the low 40s. The children wore coats indoors. Ice formed in the wash basin every night. 3 miles south, the Patterson family ran out of drywood entirely. By Christmas they were burning green timber, more smoke than heat. Their youngest daughter developed a cough that sounded painfully familiar. The same wet, rattling cough James Garrett had suffered the year before. Robert Finch, the builder who had warned Samuel about underground foolishness, lost his chimney on December 18th. A creosote fire cracked the firebox and filled the cabin with smoke. He and his wife spent 2 nights at a neighbor's house while he rebuilt it in weather so cold the mortar barely set. The entire valley was locked in a war of attrition with winter. And winter was winning. At the Garrett place, something very different was happening. Samuel moved his family into the underground chamber during the first week of December. Not because the cabin had failed, it hadn't. but because he wanted to test the system fully. And because he wanted his children warm. The routine was simple. Each morning, Samuel climbed down the ladder through the hidden trapdoor. He lit a small fire in the central pit. Not a blaze, just enough to raise the chamber from its natural baseline of 54 degrees to around 62 or 64. That was it. No constant feeding. No frantic stoking. The fire burned gently through the day and died down at night. The chamber did the rest. The stone walls, warmed slowly by the small fire and the earth's steady temperature, radiated heat long after the flames disappeared. The limestone floor stayed warm underfoot. The insulated ceiling trapped precious warmth instead of letting it bleed away into the frozen air above. And because the chamber sat below the frost line, the earth itself never froze. It stayed locked at that constant baseline, 50 degrees that required almost no effort to improve upon. By Christmas, Samuel was using 1/3 the firewood he had burned the previous winter. The children slept without coats. The contrast went beyond temperature. In the cabin, even with a strong fire, there were cold zones, corners where wind found its way in, floorboards that radiated chill, windows where frost formed, melted, and formed again. The underground chamber had none of that. 62 degrees in the center meant 62 degrees everywhere. No drafts. No cold pockets. No sudden temperature drops when the wind shifted. Elizabeth noticed it first. "Mama," she said one evening, holding her book closer to the lamp, "I can read down here at night." And she could. The steady temperature kept the lamp oil thin. The lack of drafts meant the flame didn't flicker. She sat at the small table in nothing more than a wool dress, reading comfortably. 3 miles away, children her age huddled under blankets in rooms too cold for anything but sleep. And still, nobody knew. From the outside, the Garrett place looked no different than any other farm in the valley. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney. Samuel kept a fire there during the day for cooking and appearances. The small flue behind the barn released so little smoke it was easy to miss. Snow coated the roof. Ice glazed the windows. The same beaten look winter stamped on every structure. Then, 3 days after Christmas, someone came by. Kayla Drummond. And what happened next would force every person in that valley to question everything they thought they knew about staying warm. Kayla arrived on December 28th. Caleb Drummond hadn't planned to visit that morning. But his youngest son, Timothy, had been asking questions. Real questions. The kind that lingered. He hadn't seen the Garrett children outside in over a week. No tracks in the snow. No games. No movement. And that worried him. Because in a winter like this, stillness was never a good sign. Caleb had noticed other things too. Margaret worked without her fingers going numb. The air stayed dry, breathable, and smoke-free. There were no fresh paths leading from the cabin. No constant smoke pouring from the chimney, only short bursts during the day, nothing like the desperate, round-the-clock fires everyone else was fighting to maintain. The place looked abandoned. And yet Caleb knew Samuel was home. He'd seen him near the barn hauling water, moving hay. Come. Unhurried. Not the frantic pace of a man barely keeping winter at bay. Something was wrong. So Caleb pulled on his coat and walked across the frozen ground, boots crunching through snow that hadn't melted since early December. His breath formed thick clouds that froze into his beard as he crossed the yard. He knocked on the cabin door. No answer. He knocked again, harder. Still nothing. Then he heard it. A voice. Faint. Coming from the barn. "Caleb? That you? Come around back." Caleb followed the sound and found Samuel near the rear corner of the barn, crouched beside a short chimney pipe barely rising above the snow line. Samuel looked comfortable. Too comfortable. No scarf. No heavy gloves. Just a wool coat. "Sam," Caleb said, confused. "Where's your family?" "Timothy's been asking about the kids." Samuel straightened up and smiled. Not the tight, tired smile of a man enduring winter, but a genuine, relaxed smile. "They're fine," he said. "Better than fine. Come on. I'll show you." Inside, the barn looked ordinary. Dim winter light filtered through gaps in the boards. Tools hung on the walls. Hay stacked in the corners. The smell of animals and old wood. Samuel walked to the center of the floor, kicked aside a pile of hay, and revealed a wooden trapdoor set flush with the planks. "You dug a cellar?" Caleb said. "Not exactly." Samuel lifted the door. Warm air rose up. Not hot, but unmistakably warm. Light flickered below. Voices. Children laughing. "Come down," Samuel said. "See for yourself." Caleb started down the ladder and froze halfway. The chamber below was small, 8 feet wide, 12 feet long. Stone walls fitted tight. A flat limestone floor. A timber ceiling above. A small fire burned in the center, not roaring, just steady. And sitting around a table as if it were a mild spring afternoon were Margaret and the children. Elizabeth read quietly. William carved a piece of wood. Little James stacked blocks on the floor. None of them wore coats. Margaret stood in a simple house dress, sleeves rolled to her elbows. The temperature wasn't hot. It was comfortable. Caleb reached the floor and stood there, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew. 3 miles away, his own children huddled under blankets in a room barely above 40 degrees. His wife's hands went numb if she worked too long. He had burned more wood in the past month than he usually did in 6 weeks. And here was Samuel Garrett's family, living underground, warmer than anyone Caleb knew. How, was all he managed? Samuel explained it plainly. The Earth's stable temperature. The thermal mass of the stone walls and floor. The insulated ceiling. The small fire lifting the baseline by just 10 or 12 degrees. The horizontal flue radiating heat. The ventilation shaft bringing fresh air without bleeding warmth. How much wood? Caleb asked. About a quarter cord since we moved down here. 3 weeks. Samuel nodded. Caleb did the math in his head. 8 times less wood. And warmer. The walls never freeze, Samuel said. The floor stays warm. We let the fire die at night. By morning it's still near 60. Light it again. Back to 65 by midday. Margaret spoke softly. The children haven't been sick once. Not a cough. Not a chill. Caleb climbed back up the ladder slowly. In the barn he shook his head, half in disbelief, half in embarrassment. Everyone thought you were crazy, he admitted. I told my wife you'd collapse the barn. I heard that one, Samuel said. Caleb hesitated. Can I bring people by? Some folks, they're struggling. Samuel didn't hesitate. Bring anyone who needs to see it. Within 2 days, 7 families had visited the Garrett barn. By New Year's Day 1888, it had become something of a pilgrimage site. Men who had dismissed Samuel as foolish now stood at the base of that ladder with thermometers and notebooks, trying to understand what their eyes were telling them. The numbers didn't lie. Robert Finch came with his own instruments. He measured wall thickness, timed the fire, took temperature readings across the chamber. Outside, 18 below zero. Garrett cabin, 46 degrees with a fire. His own cabin, 44. The chamber, 63. Someone muttered, that's got to be wrong. Finch held up the thermometer. It's accurate. He continued. 3 pieces of split pine. 8 pounds maybe. 6 hours of burn time. 4-degree drop. He looked around. I lose 4 degrees in 40 minutes. The meaning hit hard. Less wood. Less work. Less risk. Henry Walsh came on January 3rd. He didn't bring tools. He brought an apology. I was wrong, he said. And if this winter keeps going, people need this. Samuel agreed, not for attention but because the valley needed answers. For 2 weeks he taught anyone who asked. He drew diagrams. Explained physics. Answered fears. You don't need to be a miner, he told them. 6 feet gets you below frost line. That's enough. By late January, shelters appeared across the valley. Different designs. Same principle. And they worked. The valley adapted. Children recovered. Woodpiles lasted. And Samuel Garrett, the man they laughed at, was just glad fewer people were cold.